Okay, Assalamu alaikum. We are going to discuss the second lecture in motor system physiology, which is a continuation from the first lecture. We talk about the motor cortex, and we talk in details about the motor cortex areas. And we said also that the motor cortex is the first step, the first ordering system that give us the order, give the order to our body, our brain and spinal cord to initiate movements, to perform movements. Okay, so in this lecture we're going to discuss the transmission of these signals, how the movement executed, how we perform our movements. We need a special tract and special pathway help in transmission of the neuronal fibers or transmission of the impulses from the cortex to its end organ and end part for the movement, which is the muscle. So the transmission of signals from the motor cortex to the muscles, it's the subject of this lecture. Okay, so the motor signals to be transmitted through the spinal cord and then to the muscle, it's passed in two different pathways, okay, through two different pathways. The first one called direct pathway, direct. That is to say, it's directly passed from the cortex to spinal cord to the muscle. مباشرة راح يمشي through the spinal cord and then to the muscle. This is called the direct, and this is the main pathway for motor or for movement initiation. Okay, it's also called the corticospinal. هذا شو نسميه direct pathway؟ نسميه corticospinal. So from its name, cortico, so it's from the cortex, spinal to the spinal cord, called corticospinal. And there's another name called pyramidal tract or pyramidal pathway. This is very important word in clinical practice. راح تمر عليكم هواية pyramidal, and we will see why we call pyramidal in the subsequent slides. Okay, so we have direct and we have indirect. Indirect pathway, that is to say, the fibers or the signals to pass from the cortex to the spinal cord, it need to pass into other brain structures to initiate its function. Okay, so it is indirect. Okay, there is something extra between the cortex and the spinal cord, need for the fibers to pass through to maintain its function and to continue its tract or its pathway. So it's called indirect, and have other name called extra pyramidal. The first one called pyramidal, this is called extra pyramidal. It's extra pathway. Okay, this pathway is an accessory pathway. Okay, between the motor cortex and spinal cord, the fibers pass into different brain structures like basal ganglia, cerebellum, and other brainstem nuclei. This is called the extrapyramidal. Okay, we will start to talk about the first one called the corticospinal or pyramidal tract. This is the most important pathway. Okay, it needs to be intact for our movement to occur. Okay, it's the main pathway. Okay, it comes from the motor cortex, as we said, and comes from the different areas of motor cortex. 30% of the fibers of the corticospinal tract comes from the primary motor cortex. Okay, another 30% from the premotor and supplementary motor, and 40% from the somatosensory area, which is located posterior to the central sulcus. Okay, and then impulses comes from the sensory cortex to the motor cortex and then through the corticospinal to initiate movement. هذا التوزيع اللي تمشي بيه أو تبدأ بيه الفibers of motor cortex. Good. Now, the pyramidal or the corticospinal tract fibers or neurons اللي تعبر من منطقة إلى أخرى اللي تبدأ بالكورتكس, هذه fibers have types. Okay, about 97% of these fibers, it's small in diameter. Okay, have a slow conduction of velocity. طبيعة المايلين بيها يكون little mining, so it have a slower conduction of impulses. يعني الconduction or الإيصالية للimpulses through these nerves راح يكون or neurons راح يكون slower. Okay, ومن توصل هذه الفايبرز إلى الspinal cord, okay, it need to be synapsed with the interneurons, and you know interneurons, and this in turn synapsed with the other types of the anterior motor neurons, which are the alpha and the gamma motor neurons. Okay, The second type, which is the the second type, which is the larger type, okay, has a 97% الابundancy وين تكون بالother fibers ما إلها اسم معين، لكن هي commonest fibers النوع اللي تكون smaller and slower in conduction. Second type, which is only occupied 3%, large in size، إلها اسم خاص يسمونها best cells. هذه تكون larger in diameter, faster in conduction, velocity مالتها توصل 70 meter per second، وهذه ما عندها interconnection or synapsing with the interneurons. Directly will pass and going to synapse with the alpha motor neurons. Okay, high differences between the two fibers of the pyramidal tract. Okay, now the corticospinal pathway in details. It is started in the motor cortex. Okay, this is the precentral gyrus, and from where the motor cortex started. Okay, and this orange color represents the neurons or the fibers of the motor tract in the corticospinal tract. Started in the motor cortex and then passed down through different parts of the brain, reaching to the brainstem, passed through the midbrain, the pons, and then medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is an important part for these fibers to pass. Okay, we have a structure inside the medulla oblongata called pyramids. Okay, it's named pyramids, and now we can know from where the word pyramidal tract comes. It comes from the area through which these fibers pass in the medulla oblongata. It's named pyramids. Okay. Now, at the level of pyramids, the fibers of the corticospinal tract, most of the fibers of the corticospinal tract, will pass and cross to the opposite side. It will go through the opposite side or the cross to the opposite side medulla. Okay, it will cross or decassate, the same as occur in the somatosensory pathways. We have a decassation. So the motor movement initiated or occur of our left side of the body controlled by the right motor cortex, and the reverse is true. Okay, because there is a decassation occur at the level of medulla oblongata. The fibers that crossed here at the level of pyramids continue as what's called lateral corticospinal tract. It's named called lateral corticospinal tract. It's called lateral because it will continue and end at the level of or at the spinal cord in the lateral part of the white matter of the spinal cord, and then it will pass through the gray matter of the spinal cord at the level of the anterior part or the anterior horn, where it will synapse with the interneurons and the other anterior horn cells to continue to pass through the muscle. Okay, فإذا هذا الpathway, the main pathway for the corticospinal, the lateral corticospinal. Okay, the complex things occur at the level of medulla. It's become complicated. At the level of medulla, we will repeat. At the level of medulla oblongata, specifically at the pyramids, the fibers, most of the fibers of the corticospinal tract will decassate or cross to the opposite side, continue its pathway to reach to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, and these fibers called lateral corticospinal tract. In the spinal cord, it will pass to the anterior horn in the gray matter, then into the anterior horn to continue as a lower motor neuron to reach to the muscle. Okay, how it passes to the muscle, we already discussed and explained the structures of the spinal cord. It will pass to the anterior horn, synapse with the anterior horn cells and the interneurons, then pass to the anterior root, then to the spinal nerves, and then through the dorsal and ventral rami to reach to the muscle. Okay, reach to the muscle. This is the whole pathway of the corticospinal lateral part. We say that most of the fibers of the corticospinal tract will decassate at the level of medulla, right? When we say most, this is important to know that we have other fibers. Okay, most of the fibers, so we have a lesser fibers. Okay. The remaining of the corticospinal fibers will not decassate at the level of medulla. It will pass ipsilaterally. As you can see, we have a little fibers here, will continue ipsilaterally on the same side, right, left, will not decassate at medulla, pass through the subsequent parts of the spinal cord, and then reach to the most of the anterior aspect of white matter of the spinal cord, and it's called the anterior corticospinal or ventral corticospinal, and then again send of fibers to the anterior horn and going to synapse with the interneurons and the other anterior horn cells and continue to reach to the muscles. Okay, this is a very few fibers. Okay, يعني very few fibers, قليلة جدا ما يصير بها decassation. Actually, they found that even from these few fibers, most of these few fibers will decassate eventually, sooner or later, but not at the level of pyramids. لما تكمل المسيرة مالتها at different levels of the spinal cord, especially at the upper segment of the spinal cord, it will decassate and continue together with the lateral corticospinal. تبقى عندنا very few fibers اللي هي تمثل anterior corticospinal. فإذا in general, when patients came and have, for example, cerebrovascular accident or stroke or ischemia in the motor cortex, okay, many of the motor cortex parts damaged, and this affected on the corticospinal neurons, the patient will have signs and symptoms of his motor activities on the opposite side. For example, هو عند right side صار بالإسكيميا، فالleft side راح يتأثر أكثر because the decassation occurred for most of the fibers. Okay, يصير بها decassation. Okay, few words you need to know about what's called upper and lower motor neurons. These two terms are clinical terms, very important in clinical practice. So you need to know where are the upper motor and where are the lower motor neurons. The upper motor neurons are the corticospinal neurons or the pyramidal neurons from the cortex, okay, through the brain structures to the spinal cord لحد ما تنتهي at the level of the spinal cord before it synapses with the interneurons or the anterior horn cells. Okay, هذه يسمونها upper motor neuron. Okay, lower motor neurons مباشرة من الساينابسز with the anterior horn cell، يعني تبدأ من anterior horn cell لحد وصولها إلى آخر parts of the nerves with the muscle، هذه نسميها lower motor neurons. Why it is important? Because clinically speaking, we have diseases give upper motor neuron signs and symptoms, and we have diseases give lower motor neuron signs and symptoms. Okay, وهذا يفرق بالlocalization of the diseases. وين موجود الديزيز؟ upper motor neuron lower motor neuron. اوكي، فلازم تعرفون البوزيشن مالتها حتى مستقبلا من تمشون بالكلينيكال براكتس. You know when you hear upper and lower motor neuron, you will know what it's mean. Okay, so a refreshment for what we already mentioned. The majority of pyramidal fibers will cross in the lower medulla to the opposite side and then descend down through what's called lateral corticospinal tract. Finally terminate principally in the anterior horn, where it will synapse with the interneurons in the intermediate region of the cord in the gray matter. Okay, but a few of the fibers do not cross to the opposite side in the medulla, but pass ipsilaterally and continue as what's called ventral or anterior corticospinal tracts. Many, if not most, of these fibers eventually cross to the opposite side of the cord, either in the neck or in the upper thoracic regions, اللي هي different levels of the upper part of the spinal cord. Okay, we finished what we said about what we need to know about the corticospinal or the pyramidal tract. Now start talk about the extrapyramidal system, and again extrapyramidal mean there's an extra parts of the brain, the information or the fibers need to pass between the cortex and the spinal cord to initiate its function. Okay, so the extrapyramidal tracts, all the descending tracts other than the pyramidal tracts called extrapyramidal. Pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts should function together for smooth activity. Okay, the voluntary activities are controlled by the corticospinal. احنا هاي الموفمنت نسويها، our movements, our different movements maintained or controlled by the pyramidal fibers. But these movements sometimes need for a specific texture, need for a proper position, need for a proper coordination. We need to maintain our balance in that movement. So the assistant parts to perform this movement maintained by the extrapyramidal. Okay, so the background tone, posture, equilibrium, all are maintained by the extrapyramidal system. Okay, the extrapyramidal fibers, from where it's rise or start, it's also start in the cortex, تبدأ من الموتور cortex. Okay, and then this is the difference, it will pass to subcortical structures. Subcortical structures These are the brain structures below the cortex, okay, below the cortex. اللي هي مثلا عندنا البيزل ganglia. We will have a separate lecture for basal ganglia, very important structure. Reticular formation of the brainstem, okay, vestibular nuclei, radionucleus, and other types of nuclei have a connection with the cortex through what's called extrapyramidal pathways like the tactile and olivary nucleus. These are neuroanatomical names, okay, and we will discuss about the important physiological points in each structure. We will start in this lecture talk about the radionucleus, okay? Radionucleus, anatomically speaking, it's a nucleated structure located in the rostral midbrain. Rostral means the upper part of midbrain, rostral, okay? These are the two radionuclei. The midbrain, it's the upper part, most upper part of the brainstem called midbrain, contain many structures, okay? Many fibers will pass through it. The important points in this part is the radionucleus, okay? The radionucleus are two nuclei on each side. We have one. It's important part in the extrapyramidal system. Okay, so it's a structure located in the rostral midbrain, involved mainly in motor coordination. How it's involved in motor coordination هسه راح نشوف. Okay, so it serves as an alternative pathway for transmitting cortical signals to the spinal cord. It's alternative, not the main one. The main one is the corticospinal. Okay, so the fibers or the tracts that initiated through the radionucleus called corticorubrospinal. Corticorubrospinal. Cortico from the cortex. Rubro, this is the synonym, the same name for the radionucleus, and spinal, it means the spinal cord. How this tract formed, okay? The same. The fibers start in the motor cortex, mainly in the primary motor cortex. Then it will synapse in the neurons inside the radionucleus, inside a part in the radionucleus called magnocellular part or portion of the radionucleus. So from the cortex أول fibers راح تبدأ عندنا تذهب إلى second part اللي هو الراديونيوكليوس. داخل الراديونيوكليوس عندنا large neurons in a part called magnocellular part of the radionucleus يصير بها synapse. Then these fibers هسه لحد الآن بين الكورتكس والراديونيوكليوس صار tract اسمه corticorubral tract. Corticorubral. But this tract, to initiate its function on the muscle, need a communication with the spinal cord. Okay, so it will have a synapsing fibers from the radionucleus passing to the spinal cord called rubrospinal. Rubrospinal. فيصير التراكت اسمه corticorubrospinal. Start in the cortex, have a midway in the radionucleus, and then continue to the spinal cord and then to the muscle to exert its function. Okay, now the passage of the rubrospinal fibers from the radionucleus to the spinal cord, it's not complicated. It's simply as that pass through the corticospinal. نفس pathway of the corticospinal, it will pass through the brainstem structures and then decassate at the level of the brainstem. Also, it will cross to the opposite side and pass adjacent to the adjacent and interior to the corticospinal tract. ما بيها أي complication. Okay. Okay, فإذا عندنا this is the motor cortex. عندنا synapsing neurons start from the motor cortex, pass to the midbrain. This is the radionucleus, and then synapse with other neurons to pass through the spinal cord, and this is the level of medulla oblongata, and then it will cross to the opposite side to pass together with the fibers of the corticospinal tract. Now, we will ask ourselves, what's the function of the radionucleus or the corticorubrospinal tract in general? Okay, first of all, the radionucleus have an anatomical topographical representation of different muscles in the body, like that for the motor cortex. مثل ما أخذنا الموتور cortex عندنا representation. Also, we have representation for different muscles in the body inside the radionucleus. لكن radionucleus relatively small, فراح يكون less well developed. ما راح يكون مثل representation الموجود بالموتور cortex. Okay, actually they found that the corticorubrospinal pathway serves an accessory route for transmission of relatively discrete signals for the motor cortex to the spinal cord to initiate discrete movements. اكو نوع عندنا من الموشن or movement اسمها discrete movements. Discrete movements are the type of movements that have a purpose with a beginning and end. إنه أنا أريد أسوي فد purpose فد حركة معينة with a beginning and end وينتهي. For example, I need to kick a ball, okay, or I need to grasp a cup. فهذه الفانكشن بيها beginning وبيها end. نحتاج Corticorubrospinal tract to initiate that or to perform that movement precisely together with the corticospinal. فإذا طلاب, we need to understand that the motion or the movements of the muscles to initiate properly need for a corticospinal and need for assistant parts to help the corticospinal. One of these parts is the corticorubrospinal, okay, to help us in the discrete movements. Okay. So when we have, for example, we have a disease that causes damage and destruction to the corticospinal fibers. راحت عندنا corticospinal fibers, but the rubrospinal or corticorubrospinal fibers still intact. So here the patient still can do the discrete movements اللي قلنا عليها. He still can do it. But the very fine movements, very fine discrete movements of the distal parts of the body like the fingers and hands will be impaired. يقدر يسويها لكن with impairment. ما يسويها precisely لأن الجزء الأساسي المسؤول عن الموفمنت destroyed اللي هو الكورتيكوسباينال. تبقى عندنا كديسكريت يقدر يسوي discrete, يقدر يسوي فد function with a beginning and end لكن تكون impaired, not well performed. Okay? That's why radionucleus is an accessory pathway and needed in certain situations. That's all about second lecture. We will continue to talk about the other extrapyramidal structures and pathways in the third lecture. Thank you very much.